Call the Utility Financial Oversight Committee to order. Could we have a roll call, please?
Chairperson Engelmann.
Here.
Vice Chairperson Bennett.
Here.
Member Bowling.
Here.
Member Scott.
Here.
Member Spell.
Here.
Quorum is present.
Thank you. Staff here today is Dave Bruchetta and Darren Schultz, and of course we have our attorney, Dan Yu. Welcome. Has everybody had a chance to look at the minutes? Are there any additions or corrections? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So move.
Second.
Mr. Bowling moved, and seconded was Scott. All right, that done. Let's move on to the agenda item.
Madam Chair,
I'm sorry.
just for the record, I mean, clearly
The
we don't have
public
anyone.
comment.
Clearly, we don't have anyone here in the audience today, which is why you skipped over the public comment. But just so it's clear on the record, we did offer public comment initially.
You're correct. Is there any public comment? I'm looking at an empty room for those of you who can't see it. The room is absolutely empty except for us. I need to take a vote on the approval of the minutes. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. All right. Let's move on to the agenda item. As you know, the Board of Supervisors asked, let me first of all review the purpose of this committee, which is to more or less safeguard the reserves and the ratepayers' money and ensure that everything is going where it's supposed to go as far as the budget is concerned and other things. Since this resolution was adopted, the board has asked us to do a number of different projects over the last couple of years. And it's not clear that the resolution always allowed for that. So what we are here to do at the board's request, including, if you'll recall, the resolution didn't even let us talk about ourselves and the resolution. So what we're here to do today is to change some wording in the resolution, sort of bring it up to date, and then we'll bring it back in October for your approval. Plus, at that time, we'll be talking about some of the financial principles and so forth on which the resolution's based in part. And then it'll go to the Board of Supervisors for their adoption and approval sometime in November or December, depending upon the schedule the city manager has. So the resolution that we have here is essentially the same resolution that was adopted by the Board of Supervisors with a few tweaks. Dan, would you like to go over the changes that are in here?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that, Madam Chair. For the record, Dan Yu with the Carson City DA's office. This resolution has a couple of proposed mandatory provisions in there. The first one that I'd like to direct everyone's attention to is in paragraph 4, towards the bottom of the page, beginning with the sentence, "Each member of the utility committee shall." The second sentence there reflects that change. Any vacancies shall be filled by the board member whose appointee vacated a membership. The new appointee shall serve concurrently with the term of the board member appointing the member. That serves as a slight modification to the filling of vacancies. It makes it run concurrent with the member that appointed the vacancy to be filled. I believe that this change makes it more consistent with the intent of the resolution, makes the language a little bit clearer. The second page, this is a new paragraph at the very top. This sentence or this provision just allows this committee to have the authority from time to time as this committee may deem necessary to consider any provision of this resolution at a meeting and to provide to the Board of Supervisors additional recommendations relating to such considerations. This just basically broadens the scope of authority of this committee to entertain additional recommendations pertaining to its written provisions of this resolution, so that we don't have to seek additional permission from the Board of Supervisors at the outset before we can make these recommendations. This would just modify the resolution so that that's an inherent authority that's vested within this committee. happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions so far?
Could I?
Yes.
Dan, in the preamble, the whereases, it talks about water, sewer, and stormwater utility rates. Is it your sense then that your new paragraph 7 on the second page basically would allow us to review anything associated with those 3 utilities as part of the broadening that you spoke of?
Well, to answer your question, the new paragraph on page 2, that actually doesn't really have a specific relationship to the substantive scope of this body's authority. That new provision actually just speaks to providing additional authority for the members of this body to provide additional recommendations to the board in terms of, for example, wanting to expand its inherent authority. So it does not necessarily create additional authority at this time, but just allows this board to provide additional recommendations to the board if, for example, the expansion of authority were one of those recommendations.
I'll hold any other questions for now.
And I think, though, that that is something that we need to talk about, because I think that's exactly what the board has in mind, is that this is broad enough to where if they request us to do something, or if we feel there's something necessary for us to look at and then possibly recommend to the board, that we would be able to do that. And so would we need additional language for that, Dan?
I don't believe so. I believe that the language as written right now, the new paragraph, that would probably suffice to cover it.
So that if this committee decided it wanted to at some point go back and review the, say, the hookup fees or something like that, we wouldn't need additional language in here in order for us to do that.
So, Madam Chair, I believe that, to specifically answer your question with relation to, for example, hookup fees, I think that probably already properly falls under the review of water, sewer, and stormwater utility rates. I mean, that's something, that language in the whereas clause could probably be tweaked a little bit more to make it, I wouldn't say necessarily broader, but more succinct in terms of, what it means to monitor compliance with the financial policies of the city, but also in terms of looking at the rates. Instead of, for example, just the introduction of new rates, it may be, a prologue to that if you wanted to look at specific numbers, for example. So that's something that can be tweaked as well as an additional consideration. But with regard to the new paragraph 7 on page 2, that would just be providing this body with additional authority to provide recommendations to the board with respect to if you wanted to make any additional changes to the existing provisions of the resolution as it currently exists.
Okay, how does the committee feel about that?
Well, I guess I'm struggling a little bit with, are we talking about broadening this so the board can give us broader direction in the future if we bring to them a proposed area we'd like additional, authority in or opportunity to review and
Yes.
recommend? Because I guess, in my mind, I'm thinking of us as water, sewer, and storm drain kind of oversight group. And I'm hopeful that we don't need anything more after whatever changes we do today, and if the board approves them. I'm hopeful we don't need anything more to carry out that. And frankly, I think we would want to think very hard if we wanted to broaden much beyond that in terms of what we do. I think as I see it, we're a fairly narrowly focused group that has a specific mission.
And thank you for the comments. I certainly, as counsel, I can appreciate those comments, and I agree with the idea, the concept that, this board was formed to to meet a specific goal and purpose in mind. At the same time, I believe that the impetus for this new paragraph 7 on page 2 of this proposed resolution change is so that this body would have that authority if in the future it decided that it needed further refinement, not necessarily an expansion of its oversight powers, but just needed additional refinement, that it would not be constrained from making those recommendations to the provisions as written in the resolution to the board. So the way I look at it, in other words, is that we're really talking about two separate matters. Paragraph 7 is not intended to actually expand the powers of this board, but to make it so that this board would be able to, or this committee would be able to make those recommendations to the Board of Supervisors if further refinement was deemed to be necessary.
To me, just so we're not creating a cumbersome process to do what we're doing, we're supposed to be, short timers without too much, investment in time, and I'd hate to get ourselves into a bureaucratic circle where the resolution isn't strong enough to do what we think we're supposed to be doing. And as long as we're reconciled in that vein, the only other thing I would suggest is consideration of whether the termination of the committee should be stricken, and that we serve at the pleasure of the board, or the committee continues at the pleasure of the board, or something like that in paragraph 4. Because that'll set us up for another resolution if the board decides after next budget year that they would like this committee to continue. So that, I think, and potentially the staff's going to tell us they want to get rid of us anyway, but or maybe we're help, I don't know. But I'm not suggesting that anything but facetiously, but at the same time, if the committee is useful, maybe we don't want to set ourselves up in such a way that the resolution expires without some further, action. That's just an observation.
And just in response to that real quickly, I just wanted to be clear on the record that, these recommendations, or these proposed changes in this draft resolution, they're not my recommendations per se with respect to policy matters. I really try to stay out of those lanes. I'm just here to provide counsel and guidance with respect to how these recommendations ought to be drafted for purposes of incorporation in this written document. As far as the intent or the purpose, that's to be carried through with these incorporated changes, those are really matters of policy that are better left to the sound discretion of these members.
Thank you, Dan. I sort of agree with Bruce on that. I know that I've had a couple of members of the Board of Supervisors say how impressed they are with this committee, how it works, how it operates, and the recommendations we brought to them. And certainly we appear so far to have the public trust. And I think that's important to the board and important to the public. I would agree with Bruce's recommendation for leaving the termination up to the Board of Supervisors. Certainly we have elections and the Board of Supervisors changes, and I think we do serve at, each of us is appointed by a separate member of the board, and we serve at their pleasure. How does the rest of the committee feel about that?
I would agree with Bruce's comment, as well as the clarification. I appreciate the clarification from Dan, is that this, the new Section 7 appears not to broaden any authority or purview, but to remove constraints should additional action be requested. And I also agree with Bruce's comment about the termination. Right now, the termination of the committee takes place June 30th, 2018, and it requires board action to continue.
Right.
But based on the recommendation, as I understand it, it would take action on the board to terminate the committee.
Correct. The committee would go on until the board terminates. So therefore, if they wanted to terminate us sooner than 2018, they could, and or keep us going longer.
I like Bruce's add, but I would also, with regards to the termination date, but I'd also like to hear staff's thoughts on what they see, what they would like to see the role of the Utility Finance Oversight Committee to be.
Darren? Is that
Sure.
10 pages of
Sure.
a speech you have?
Yeah, I do. I was up all night, but I didn't memorize it. Pardon me. Yeah, I don't, in terms of the red line that was handed out, that was just kind of some starting verbiage. In terms of the actual date in removing that, yeah, I think that's almost a no-brainer and pretty easy, just that the utility committee will continue unless it's determined by the Board of Supervisors to be terminated. In terms of the role of this committee, I think it's been a good relationship so far, the last couple of years, 3 years. And I agree that the Board of Supervisors are pleased with how it's been going. I think what happens, and maybe I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, this is just my perspective of how we got here today, is there are times when we go to the Board of Supervisors for a particular item within the utility, and once in a while it's asked of us, was this item brought before the Utility Financial Oversight Committee, of which we always we reply A or nay, depending on the item. And so sometimes we say no, and they say, well, why wasn't it? And our response is that this doesn't fall under the guidelines, the current guidelines of the Utility Financial Oversight Committee. And then maybe you'll hear, well, maybe it should, or whatever. That varies depending on the meeting and the year. So I think in my mind, that's the background, is how we got here today. I think there's probably some outlier things that also contributed to it. So my impression is that the intention of the Board of Supervisors, I don't want to speak for them, I just want to tell you my impression is that they want to make sure that we're being as transparent as possible with our information. It's not that we don't have the information, it's just, is the information being in a public forum such that people have an opportunity to see it, to view it, to come and talk about it. Everything is there. Our meetings twice a year, we put a lot of information in those 2 meetings, especially to do with the budget, and it's all there, but it's a very complicated process. So I just wonder if it's maybe more of a, hey, how can we make this as transparent as possible, make sure the information is out there. I don't get the impression, nor would I be in favor of something put in place to where it hinders our day-to-day operation within Public Works and these utilities. We get a lot done. We have a lot of things going on, and I just want to be careful that we don't hinder that process. But I'm totally open to any sort of thing that would bring more transparency to Carson City, our Board of Supervisors, and so any suggestions that you might have, we'll be happy to comment on those in particular.
Thank you, Darren, and I think that is the intention of this committee, is we don't have the time, frankly, to bother with you day to day. I don't think, I mean, I believe, except for Mike, who thought he was retiring until he got on this committee, we're all working people, and we have busy lives, and so, which is why we like efficient meetings. And, so I'm sure that this committee is not interested in interfering with your day-to-day activities, and we're more interested in the transparency and oversight. And there are times that things come up that you and I've discussed, that maybe if we had a public hearing on that, then we could clarify the record and have people understand a little bit better what's going on. And you and I have discussed ways possibly of other ways we could get some funding into the water system, which is something I want to discuss down the road. Maybe, we've looked at different creative ideas in other places and so forth. So I think there are things that we can do that don't take up a lot of our time and won't take up your time, but will enhance the whole project, is what I would hope.
I might add, David and I talked a little bit about coming here today and what this would bring, and it really needs to come from this committee, and we want that to happen. But one possibility would be, we currently meet twice a year. It's, there's a lot of things we cram into those meetings. Maybe a suggestion that we would meet approximately quarterly, and then that would be, from staff's perspective, we would bring to those quarterly meetings not a lot more for action items than you currently have, but more of an update of where we are for that quarter in terms of how things are looking, contracts to be awarded, where we're focusing our energy, and also topics that are on the horizon, as you referred to, in terms of rates, weather patterns, all those things that affect our day-to-day operations, and we could just provide an update in that and get some input back from you in terms of thoughts on the matter, for informational only, and then if you saw something that hey, we really, this is a key item here, we could have that discussion in terms of, you know, what are we doing with it, and are we doing enough, and would you like to, we would like this item to come back at a future meeting for action. That's sort of an opportunity. So that was just a general thought that we had where this might want to go, but once again, we're really open to what you folks feel your role should be.
How does the committee feel about that? I think the quarterly meetings might be a good idea. I know that I want to meet later in the year, closer to the final budget, so that we see a final budget when it goes to the board, instead of, like last time, we approved a budget and then it got changed, and what went to the Board of Supervisors wasn't the budget that we had approved, and that's a little frustrating. So, committee members?
I like the idea of feeling like we're able to get a little bit ahead of the curve as opposed to reacting. So the quarterly meetings to me would be acceptable from my perspective and probably helpful.
I would agree as well, and here's why, is that when we meet at the first part in the spring, make a decision or recommendation on the budget, we have no idea what's going to happen throughout that 12-month period. So it gives us a chance to review the direction that the Public Works and Utilities is going through. Plus, it provides us an opportunity to provide support to staff as to where you want to go to better serve the public here. So, like Bruce, I agree.
Mr. Spell, you've been very quiet. Would you like to make a comment?
I've got several, but that kind of are moving in and out and where we're going. And I think all we're here for is, just like any Nevada revised statute, it starts off of a statute and it's going to get amended for clarification purposes. And you look at really all the resolution says is we're formed to monitor compliance with utility financial policies. That's pretty broad. And then we go to the actual city financial policies, and we've got problems within the policies. And then I even take it one step further. We have a study of 2 utilities that drove this whole thing, and then we drag in stormwater with it. These are all things that need to be clarified, I believe, to really give us our scope, give the agency the scope. What are they supposed to provide us so that we can provide the board? I'm all for progress meetings on a budget. I'll never say no against that, especially now that we have huge CIP projects going. I love to see work in progress reports. I love to see the reports that they've been generating. what funds are paying for these projects. Then when we come down to the budget, we have a lot better knowledge of what we're seeing in front of us and what has happened. So these are all little issues that we have to, I think, get clarified. And it's not, I don't think it'll be just clarified all this time. I think it's going to be ongoing every time. And that's where this final number 7 does give us that ability. Hey, something else within what we feel is our purview has popped up. Let's get better clarification on what we should be doing with it, especially if we want this committee to go beyond the planned termination date.
Yes, I agree. You know, I mean, there's some things that are out there now, such as the contract with Minden on the water, which could have an impact on the budget that we would have to come in, I think, and I see us helping, working with staff and, you know, seeing what we can do on that and so forth. And so, I mean, there's things that can happen throughout the year that I think, you know, we would be called on anyway. So, you know, we might as well sort of look at quarterly meetings or something along those lines. Mike, you're frowning. Did you?
No, not at all. I share a lot of Mike's thought on this. I struggle because I don't want us to have a huge expansion in role. I don't want to be overbearing to the Public Works Department, but me personally, it's very difficult to get the fire hose of information in February and digest it and try to recap what happened over the last 12 months and try to understand what the prediction over the next 12 months is going to be in that one February meeting, and then summarize that again in March. I agree ongoing meetings would be, I believe, more appropriate. Progress reports, you know, how do we look on our capital improvement plans for whatever the fund is? You know, I've always been a little bit confused. Do we provide recommendation to the board for the capital improvement plan? I mean, we do for the budget, but, the budget includes the capital improvement plan. So by default, are we making recommendation on that? You know, it's those types of questions. I feel like as Mike said, the language is very vague, but I think the board's intent for us was to be more of the sounding board and have more of that public discussion with regards to how the utility funds are spent and reinvested into infrastructure and into operations and so on. And then for us to make recommendation to the Board of Supervisors without them having to hear all of that at their level. But that's my opinion.
And I would agree with that. I think that's exactly what, the board has a limited amount of time, and they're all busy, and so by having us delve into this and giving the public an opportunity to have their say, again, I'm looking out at an empty room, but to have their say, it sort of relieves them a bit of a burden. And I know that the board has a lot of trust in this committee and takes our recommendations very seriously, and gives it a lot of credence. Again, I think, yeah, particularly now that we can get the budget by project, I have found that extremely helpful, and I think as far as the CIP is concerned, that helps too. I mean, it's, you know, when you see 6 snowplows, you think, what the heck is that, you know? But if you see it by project, then it makes a little bit more sense to you, and it's easier to explain to people, you know. So, anyone else have a comment they want to make as far as the number of meetings, Bruce?
Well, I made my comment on that.
Well, okay, well, okay, go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on what Darren said with regard to staff taking things to the board and the board saying, did you ask the Utility Finance Oversight Committee? And sometimes it's yes and sometimes it's no. Are there things that staff feels we should be reviewing? And among those things, do we have the authority under the resolution we're looking at modifying now from the perspective that you would see it. In other words, the resolution we're working on, does that address the kinds of things you think this committee would be helpful for from a staff perspective?
I think the one item that was brought up already, the Minden water, that to me, that is potentially something that could have been brought, or in the future could be brought to this committee. What I personally, we feel like we should steer away from is sometimes we get asked when we go to award a contract for the next leg of the east-west water transmission main. So it's a $1.5 million contract to Joe Blow Contracting. We take that to the Board of Supervisors for award, and it's often during those awards of contracts, has this been before the Utility Financial Oversight Committee? And we say no. And what has been before this committee is the budget, the yearly budget, and within that budget is east-west transmission main phase 3. And we have a placeholder in our budget as to how much should that cost. Once we go throughout that year and it's designed, ready to go out for bid, basically all we're doing is awarding that contract. I feel like it's not a relevant step necessarily to bring that contract before this committee, because we've already agreed that the work is part of our work plan. It's budgeted, it needs to be done. So I'm not sure what the recommendation or what service that this committee would provide, other than say, yes, we agree to award this contractor to the low bidder, and then we just take that up. And the reason number one, I'm not sure what it provides, big picture wise, and number two, that would hinder our schedule in terms of awarding contracts and getting projects done. So those are two different things that have come up at the Board of Supervisors in terms of whether or not your oversight was involved. And so I personally, the contract side of things, we don't think it belongs there, even though sometimes they ask us. And I think generally they probably they have a lot going on and maybe just forget. But then these other more bigger regional, oversight type of issues or programs that are underway, it seems like that would be more appropriate to just get some feedback and also have the public opportunity to come and hear it and listen to it before it ultimately someday would go before the Board of Supervisors.
If I could comment on that, I was asked by a member or two of the Board of Supervisors how we would feel. Could we please go over all the contracts? And I said, absolutely not. There's no way that this committee has that time, nor do I think we have that purview. I think there was concern, particularly with that large contract that had what is the name again of the new sewer plant? I'm sorry, I'm not good with these.
Water
Water reclamation. What's the do we have a short term for it?
It's a water resource recovery facility.
I know, but can't we come up with a short name for it? Wharf. Okay, that's good. That works for me. And I think the landscaping was an issue before the Board of Supervisors, and I got asked, had we gone over the landscaping portion that was $50,000, didn't we feel that was a lot of money to spend on the landscaping? And I confessed to them we really hadn't focused in on that. And then I did suggest that maybe they should change the criteria for commercial landscaping so that it wouldn't apply to the wharf. And because you were following the criteria that exists in the city for commercial. So on that. So no, I don't see us doing contracts. I think once we do this budget by project, once we get the projects, I think we'll be hitting a lot of the things that they were concerned with, and I think that will make it clearer.
Yeah, I would you know, the last thing we need to be is meddling in projects. The capital budget is something that I think is legitimately in the big picture, maybe part of the budget review process that we do, but none of us up here, I don't think, anticipated the level of effort to properly review contracts that a commitment to this committee would make, and I think that's way out of our purview. And you're very diplomatic, Darren, but I think it would be fair to tell the board we don't think that's our job.
Mr. Bowling, did you want to make a
The only
comment?
thing just to comment on what Bruce said and what Darren had said is that we should not be an extra layer in getting projects out. We should be here to, if anything, improve and increase the efficiency of staff and what they do. We're not the Public Works Director. That's why the city manager has Darren here. We're here to provide oversight, and that's a larger picture of this is what the CIP is, the capital improvement program we're seeing coming up for the next year. It's got so much money in it. And if the board comes, as the project comes up for award, is this project in the CIP approved by the Utility Financial Oversight Committee? That's a thumbs up. If it's a thumbs down, then they might have a concern.
Okay, so I think we all pretty much agree on that. I think we're not here to hinder you, and I would expect that if you find that at any time we are, that you would let us know. Okay, send flowers. So I have a concern with a part of this resolution as far as item 2. The board didn't even realize that this language existed. And so I think we either need to delete that or say that the board shall be composed of people which each member feels is appropriate to appoint, or something along those lines, because I think certainly the Board of Supervisors knows what they're doing when they appoint people. It's an individual appointment. Everybody has their own idea of what kind of person they want to appoint, and I think we just leave it up to them instead of having some criteria in here. Anybody else have
Yeah,
comment?
I would agree. Obviously, engineering should be in there, but I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek.
Yes, sir.
I agree. And, you know, the other side would be people with knowledge of Carson City.
Right, and rate setting.
Yeah, but I think the minute you try to start defining it, you create holes, or you maybe eliminate people who would be good members of a committee.
Would the committee, you know, I could take motion by motion by motion, or else we can sort of, I mean, I think we agree that we want to meet quarterly. Would people agree that we either delete or change item 2?
I support that.
Yeah, I mean, we would lose, if we followed this, we'd lose our wonderful chairperson.
Not necessarily. I represented the Press Association before the Public Service Commission. I represented the Press Association before the Public Service Commission in setting rates for small businesses and so forth. So I have some experience as far as this is concerned.
Well, I think right now our board is as good as you can get. We've got a cross-section of everything, and I love having the engineers here. I feel outmanned most of the time, but it's okay.
It's about the right ratio, Mike.
That's right. Any business has 10,000 engineers and one accountant.
And I walk a tightrope. That's all right. At one time, I was the executive assistant to the head of engineering for Fairchild Camera and Instrument, and had 23 engineers that I had to help write reports. So,
One of their strong points.
yeah, right. They're very wordy. Anyway, that's all right. I'm with you, Mike Spell. So, you know, they outnumber us, but that's okay. All right, so I think we want to delete item 2 or just change the wording on it. I think we could just delete it. Mr. Yu, what do you think? Can we just delete it?
Madam Chair, you know, I think my recommendation would be rather than completely eliminating that provision, to maybe just modify it somewhat. You know, I see a couple of different options here for drafting purposes. We can modify it to incorporate some of that language you had just referenced on the record, which would be for this committee to be composed of people, you know, members whom, you know, the Board of Supervisors may feel is appropriate for membership. I'm just, you know, speaking just kind of colloquially here. We don't necessarily also have to remove the rest of that existing provision with regard to knowledge and expertise relevant to finance, accounting, or related fields. I mean, we could say, for example, you know, that, I mean, if that's something that this committee wants in terms of desirable qualifications, you know, for an appointing supervisor to consider when making an appointment, certainly we could, my recommendation would be then to keep that language in there, make it so that it's not exhaustive or, you know, all-inclusive. We could just make it so that it's broad. I mean, right now it's fairly broad in the terms of it, in terms of the sense that it uses that phrase or related fields. We could broaden it even more. So that would be my recommendation, is just to keep that provision intact, modify it a little bit, and then just to modify the end of the sentence to say, including without limitation, the following, you know, qualifications. That can be, you know, perhaps desirable.
I was going to maybe simplify it on, you know, and say the utility committee shall be composed of people with relevant knowledge and experience.
I like that. Can we use that language?
And, I mean, that's fine. I don't see a problem with that. We can just simply say relevant knowledge and experience. I mean, it doesn't really tie in anything else. So the recommendation from the members here, I think, what I'm hearing is just to remove any specific reference to particular fields of study.
Yes, because I think otherwise it sort of insinuates that the board doesn't know what they're doing or doesn't know who to appoint and so forth. And I think that we need to credit them, you know, with understanding what would be relevant to this committee.
Sure, I could do that.
Chair.
Mr. Scott?
Go ahead.
Chair, if I may, and members, I just, and maybe everybody knows this, but I wanted to make sure we go on the record. So the idea was to make these recommendations, and then the DA's office would try and incorporate them into a draft, and then it would come back before this committee in October with them taking what he thinks he hears today as a draft. So it's not, you don't have to remember every little thing that we're talking about today. There's not gonna be a vote at the end of the meeting to adopt what we came upon. So I just want to go on the record with that.
Well, actually, I want to be a little bit more exacting that, because my concern is if we bring it back in October and it doesn't exactly fit what the committee wanted, then we're back for another meeting again. So,
You can modify it in October. It's just trying to, for instance, these words that we're talking about, Dan would write those out, but in October, if one of those words strikes you and you want to change it, you could do it in that meeting. The intent for today's meeting isn't to adopt what it would say, or is it? Or, oh, it is?
yeah,
Okay.
that was my intention. And and then we could see the finished document in October. I don't want to take something to the board that this committee has not seen. Okay, I want the committee to see every period, every word that's going to be shown to the Board of Supervisors. So yes, that was my intention, to take action on this today, you know, as far as recommendations, and then Dan would bring it back in October and we could take a final look at it then, you know, and hopefully it would pretty much
We're saying the same thing, I'm sorry.
But yes, I do want to, because we have, besides this, we want to take up the financial end of it in October. And so And I think Mr. Spell is straining to speak, so.
I think we're going to have to take up some financial today as well that has to go into this document. It's specific to the utilities, and that cannot be in a citywide financial plan. I'll get to those.
Well, here's my concern. You mean, is it language that is in this resolution that we're looking at? Well, my problem then is, Dan, we can't do it because it's not agendized, right?
That's correct, Madam Chair.
I'm
do
sorry,
want to
I'm
discuss
sorry.
it, though. We don't have to make a motion or move it, but
Right.
you know what I've been dealing with. I've been dealing with the city's financial plan with the agency. And people want some real strict adherence to compliance policy. Some of this stuff will not fit in the citywide because it's so specific to two entities, water and sewer, that we got to figure out if we want compliance with that policy, where do we put the language?
You also made a statement earlier that stormwater wasn't involved. And, yes, stormwater's been mentioned, I mean, we've approved it in every budget.
Right.
We've had stormwater. So could we hear a bit of a conversation between you and Darren to explain to me, explain to the committee, I mean, we've been talking about stormwater all along, and you're saying it doesn't fit in? I'm a bit confused.
Well, I see the driving force of this resolution was FCS study on rates. They did not look at stormwater. They looked at water and sewer. All of our financial compliance, when the citywide financial policies were developed after this study, it was part of the study. The resolution came about in the financial policies. We came up with specific policy for enterprise funds. Well, the problem of it is there's more than two enterprise funds, more than sewer and water. That's where we get into, it does not, well, let me go back. So we had two enterprise funds driving this whole study and the financial plan. But we want compliance with these policies that came out of a rate study for water and sewer. They did not look at at the stormwater. So where does that fit into this situation?
Darren, I think this is a conversation we've had before, too, because as I recall, when the board adopted the rates, the FCS rates, stormwater got left out of it at the time, right? And we've brought it up to the board a couple of times, sort of indicating we would like them to decide if they want us to set rates for the stormwater, and they've nodded, and that's it. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, unless you've seen something I haven't seen, I don't recall whether or not they've actually ever taken a vote on that.
No, they have not in terms of stormwater. And I agree exactly what Mr. Spell has said. That's how we've got here, and that is part of what we have to fix. So, but today, the idea is anything that's in this resolution, 2013-R-45A, is on the table, and it can be changed, tweaked, your recommendations per this. Then it's my understanding that the next meeting we have, then we would go back at the financial policies that support this resolution, and we would address those. So, yeah, there's a little bit of area that maybe one works with the other, but as far as today, anything that's here that relates to that and even mentions financial policies, it's on the table for discussion.
And Madam Chair, if I may clarify, just so that there's no misunderstanding or confusion, I mean, we can certainly speak to matters relating to the city's financial policies as it relates to this resolution. You know, my caveat would just be not to step beyond that to make recommendations or changes to the actual policies themselves, because that's not an agendized item.
That was not my intent. We're not going to discuss any changes to the financial policies for review today. But there are issues that have come up through looking at the financial policies that this committee is very interested in, that falls under the purview of this compliance with financial policies. And we're having a hard time fitting them in, staff is, these specific issues into a citywide policy. So the discussion has been, is it better to put some of those in this resolution, which is specific only to water, sewer, and maybe stormwater? Because I think there's some pushback on the city central staff that these should not be in a citywide policy.
And just a quick comment on that, Mr. Spell, if I may, Madam Chair. You know, I think that's an idea that, you know, I've heard. I can't even recall at this point, you know, where I may have heard those concerns from. But, you know, in terms of, you know, would that be advisable or not? You know, I certainly think that, you know, it's in line with the concerns that I've heard throughout today's meeting, which is, you know, is there a lack of parameters? Is there a lack of defining parameters and instructions and direction to the members as to how to proceed? And what does oversight exactly entail? What does that embody? And certainly by incorporating some additional provisions of those policies as it relates to this committee, you know, perhaps that would be an approach to consider anyway, to provide some of those parameters that are perhaps right now either not completely clear or maybe not even, you know, in existence as the resolution is currently drafted. So in other words, what I'm saying is I you know, I would not be opposed to such a suggestion from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, the second whereas does include stormwater utility rates. And so I think to some degree we at least have a basis there, but the utility financial policies are mentioned 2 or 3 times in the resolution. And Mike, I guess I don't know enough about the specifics of what you're finding, but is that too broad for what we're trying to do or what you think we may want to incorporate? And it sounds almost like enterprise accounting, which is closer to what we might do for water and sewer or might be involved in for water and sewer, is not something that policies would necessarily apply from the city central accounting folks across the board. Is that, I'm trying to get a handle on how we can implement what you're saying and understand it enough to be helpful.
Yes, there's some specific debt management policies, some capital reserve policy, and operating reserve policy that came out of the study that was presented to the board as to what water and sewer had nothing to do with stormwater. And the city policy, to have a broad city policy to come up with these specific issues, they would fall maybe in a range. Well, that's not what our committee needs. We have specific recommendations. And if you're going to say, are they in compliance, they could be in compliance with city policy and not with specific policy from the study, which we're also using for our budgets. When you get to our reserves, we have the 2% for capital reserves, 2% of all fixed assets. We have for water, operating reserve of 60 to 90 days. We have for sewer, an operating of only 30 to 45 days because their funds are much more steady than the water. But the city can't be that specific on a citywide financial policy for enterprise funds because there's other enterprise funds besides water and sewer. Stormwater, one of them.
Well, I think what we had originally envisioned when you and I talked, Mike, was a policy that would pertain within Public Works to the water sewer fund. As far as the stormwater, I went before the board and told them just what we had said, that we were not in compliance. You know, that because we hadn't done anything on stormwater, we haven't done anything on the rates, and so it was not in compliance with the policies. And they nodded, and you know, and accepted the report. We didn't make a recommendation. We more or less put a question to them as to what they wanted to do about stormwater. And Darren then got up and explained to them again what had happened and that rates hadn't been adopted, you know, for stormwater at the time they'd done water and sewer. And I think that's where it's been ever since. I don't think there's been any changes. And so I understand your frustration, Mike, on the on the financial end of it, but I think we're all in the same boat here, that you know, until the board says, yes, go adopt some rates and so forth, we're just sort of going along on the stormwater.
Well, the stormwater, yeah, that is going to have to be worked out. But we already have recommendations in front of us that where do they fit from a policy standpoint? Are they going to have to go, because they don't fit into a citywide policy to, right, the way it's structured, and that's the way central accounting wants it. So where do we put those requirements, those recommendations, because that's what this is all about, is those reserves. That's why we're here. But we don't have any guidelines right now. Because the policy, well, that's why they're amending the city policy. The way it was written was, first of all, on the capital account, I mean, it was so confusing. They made it appear like these were all additional funds within capital. No, there's only one capital fund. They're clarifying that. But it's being clarified for all enterprise funds.
If I could bring you up to date, when Mike sat down with Darren and Dave to go over our area, the city got interested in looking at it for all the enterprise funds and deciding they wanted to do a sort of citywide change, bring things up to date. And a lot of this is what we're going to discuss at our next meeting. So,
So I apologize, Madam Chair.
all right.
I might be a little dense here. But we have, and this is where I'm going to confuse Mike, we have financial policies for water and sewer already, correct? From the previous study?
We have recommendations for what those should be, yes, from FCS.
And the city is trying to determine if they want to adopt those policies now?
No, the city did adopt. They did adopt them in the financial plan, in the city's financial policies. But the way they were written up, it was very confusing to the accounting staff as to really what is, because it was under the subtitle Enterprise Funds. And we have more than water and sewer in enterprise funds. But they got into the specifics. That's, remember, the 2% for capital reserves. And then it also talked about let's see. The system reinvestment funding. That was a separate area. It made it appear that that was a fund in itself. It's not. It's buried within, it's just a funding mechanism for the capital account. And then it also talked about emergency reserves as a separate line item. And it made it appear like these were all different funds in addition to the capital account.
And if I could interrupt just a minute, what Mike came up with was an idea on how things could be changed a bit to offer more transparency for the funding, for the budgeting and the funding, which is what we're all for, is more transparency. And so subsequently, he went and met with them, and everybody liked his ideas, so now it's been sort of adopted more, but that's
Okay, so
supposed to be our next meeting.
I'm following that, but I'm getting confused as to why we're mixing in these other possible enterprise funds with the discussion we're having today. Or maybe we're not, and that's what I'm getting confused with.
I'm looking for a document that we can have some specific compliance issues to fulfill our requirement. And there's a possibility, and I don't know, there's a possibility there won't be a document after the next meeting that has those requirements that are as specific as we need them.
Mr. Scott?
Question to Mike. Do you think the FCS guidelines are sufficient for water and sewer in terms of the documentation and the specifics as far as our committee's role in the oversight?
No, because those were a recommendation from an outside group. They have to be codified someplace.
I got you, okay. So potentially we have two utilities that we deal with, water and sewer, that have the opportunity to be codified in some manner with very specific percentages or guidelines.
Yes.
And we've been actually using those for 2 years now.
Right.
But we don't have such a thing for the storm drain.
Right.
And that's another future item for discussion.
Yes, what we had been using is the existing financial policies that are somewhat misstated and confusing. They're being cleaned up, and in cleaning them up, there is a pushback to be too specific for water and sewer.
In that the city central staff does not want to be as specific as the FCS studies were. Is that what?
They don't want the citywide policy to be that specific because they want to make it should be a minimum of this and a maximum of that. Well, we have specific stuff within that range.
But we're happy with water and sewer. It's the central staff is concerned about applying those same policies to other enterprise funds that may have different conditions or different situations. Is that?
Evidently, the financial staff would like all the enterprise funds to be the same, to be handled the same and looked at the same. And we want more specific on the water sewer than they want citywide.
Is it an impossibility that there are multiple policies within the enterprise fund that deals with specific enterprise funds?
First, I just want to make a comment that Mr. Spell was, I know this is a difficult concept because we've had a lot of conversation about this. The board-approved financial policies are for all the funds for Carson City. So this is what goes to the Board of Supervisors, and they approve it. There are specific policies that FCS recommended, unique and specific to water and to sewer, that are not incorporated necessarily in the enterprise fund, the utility, not utility, but the enterprise funds, because there are other proprietary funds that they have to look at. They're overarching, they're broad. So if we got too specific, and they didn't, because this is for the whole city, it gets very complicated if you want to bring in specific ones to water and sewer. So one option would be to maybe possibly a committee suggested or recommended for water and sewer. It just didn't, it got very, very complicated to try and add that to overarching policies where you have different funds that are enterprise funds.
So we can't have multiple policies for enterprise funds. We need, the city staff is looking for one policy for the enterprise fund, whereas it could be broad, let's say, but we have an overarching requirement to comply with the FCS studies. That's what we're looking for, right? So city central policies up here, we're narrowing down here, and we're trying to comply with this. Okay.
And the problem with that, the utility funds being specific, then you don't want to create a separate category outside of the enterprise funds because they are an enterprise fund. So you can't just call them something else and put them in a different category because they fall under what an actually enterprise fund is. So trying to figure out how those policies, and some of our conversation back and forth was, can we establish these policies as this committee? And it doesn't go up and go into the general accounting of what they're looking at because they really don't care. We more than meet their qualifications. But do we establish a policy at this committee level to meet those specific for water, sewer, and ultimately storm drain?
And let me say, that's what I was hoping that we could do, particularly at the next meeting. My plan was to, however, to recommend that portion to the board and then refer the rest of the financial policy of the city to the board, because that's not our purview.
Right.
You know, so I would refer that to them to take and do with as they please. You know, do a study of it, adopt it, you know, whatever. But that we would not recommend the citywide portion, we would only recommend the part that applied to water and sewer and stormwater, or whatever we decide on that. So, but.
And I think how one of the ways this all got started by Mr. Spell was, if one of the paths we're going to go down in terms of those specific policies for utilities, should that fall somehow within this resolution that we're talking about today? And if it does, if it's just part of this committee and those are specifically what you're looking at, then it would be within this resolution. And the accounting policies for enterprise funds would just remain the same. They're citywide enterprise funds accounting, we fall within that. But if it needs to be more specific for this committee, well, then should it fall within this resolution?
Mike, Spell, excuse me, did you have any specific language you thought you would like to see incorporated in this? I'm sorry, I didn't have the microphone on. I'm sorry, Kathy. Mike, did you have any specific language that you thought you might like to have incorporated into the resolution?
Well, I'm looking, I have in front of me a document that FCS Group presented to the Board of Supervisors on April 18th, 2013. I think we might have had this handed out before, but it shows it shows 5 recommendations. First one is operating reserve, and it says why, and then it says for water, operating account balance equal to 60 to 90 days of O&M. Sewer, 30 to 45 days. And then the capital contingency reserve, minimum balance in the capital account equal to 2% of system fixed assets. And then system reinvestment funding. This is very critical to the CIP, but it's not part of, you can't say it's not an account. It's just rolled up into the capital contingency reserves.
And are you saying you'd like to see that specific language incorporated into the resolution? I mean, I think we could do that. If staff agrees that that would work, I would want to hear from them.
If not in the resolution, we have to have it somewhere. And we're going to, if the city does amend those policies, they're not going to be this specific.
Can I ask a question? Maybe it'll help clarify. In the resolution, the whereases, the second one and the third one both talk about utility financial policies. Could we indicate something like utility financial policies together with specific policies related to the purview of the committee, as may be recommended by the committee, or something that would allow us next meeting to, in effect, approve the FCS guidelines? That would give us a little flexibility and at the same time not make a resolution that's got too much detail, as that would come back to haunt us.
Yeah. I was looking at number 3 on here and wondering if we couldn't incorporate some language into number 3 on the resolution. It says, in compliance with board-adopted utility financial policies in preparation of annual budgets, and we could maybe add or reference FCS goals or criteria. Yeah.
Did, Public Works or Council, you guys may not know the answer to this, but was the FCS study ever officially accepted by the board? So could we, in the resolution, refer to the policy as accepted by the board?
That's exactly what the conclusion we had just come to was could we say in that second whereas that was brought up, something about the board desires impartial review and recommendations from qualified persons regarding compliance with Carson City utility financial policies as outlined or as referenced or as recommended in the FCS adopted utility rate study dated such and such. Now, one thing that we need to be aware of is then that's date certain, and it's based on this policy, this review, and it's our intent in, a couple, 3, 4 years, whatever, we will do an updated rate study, and that would change. So we'd want to make sure that we modify this as well.
You'd have to update the resolution
Right.
at the same
Right.
time.
Right, which we're allowed to do per the language put in. But
Well, just to chime in on that, just a couple of things, substantively, I'm fine with all this. I would just say that, just so we don't get sideways on this, any of these substantive changes should not be included in the whereas clauses. That's just, those are just the whereas provisions setting up the parameters of this resolution. It really should go in, as Madam Chair pointed out, probably in paragraph 3, which establishes the purpose of this committee. That's just one thing. The second thing is with respect to any of the adopted changes by the board in relation to the FCS, recommendations. It's not necessarily that once we incorporate those most recent set of changes that we'd have to continuously come back and modify, this resolution to reflect those changes. I'm certain that I would be able to craft language to make it so that it would just be an ongoing adoption of the successor, changes to the FCS recommendations as adopted and approved by the board. So that's language that I could tinker around with.
Well, that sounds good to me. Is that agreeable to everybody? Yeah, Rand,
Just a brief question. Mike, you described citywide financial policy and then the financial policies contained or recommended in the FCS report. Are the FCS recommendations more conservative or are they compliant with citywide?
No, they're stricter than citywide.
Stricter but still compliant?
Yeah, they fall within the citywide.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
So I'm going to ask this a different way for clarification. If we meet the requirements of the FCS study, we will then in turn also meet the requirements of the citywide policy.
that's correct.
Can we go on to a different one, or are we done with that one? To me, I think
we
that's
beat it up to
I
this
think that's a
point.
pretty practical solution, and I like the idea that you crafted in a way that the FCS recommendations of whatever they were as maybe, amended in the future or something like that. Back to number 2, I was under the impression that it's necessary that people be residents of Carson City to be on this committee. And I'm thinking that we should include composed of people, residents of Carson City or something we should stick in there to deal with that.
actually, the charter requires that all the members be members of Carson City and that you be registered voters. And that's a requirement in our charter for all committees.
Okay.
So it's redundant. In other words, if we were to try to add something like that, it would just be redundant to another
Correct.
document. Okay.
But the trouble is it's redundant to a document that nobody reads. All right, I'll defer to the chair. Number 5, if we're talking about quarterly meetings, we need to tweak the language in number 5.
Right. So let me ask the committee. Our budget meeting will probably come later in the year, so it, may be March, it may be April. How would you feel about having a planning meeting in January to sort of look preliminarily at the budget and also talk about the coming year, and what we may, if there's anything special we want to look at or study or take up? Or would you want to wait and have your first meeting farther into the spring, closer to the budget?
I like the idea of a January meeting because we may or may not have some of the budgetary information, but we could certainly look at the capital budget, the capital program for the upcoming year, and help us get our feet on the ground for the next meeting going forward. That would not be a huge impact on staff that way, as I would see it.
No, we would agree with that. But, so then it's quarterly. I'm not sure we should use those terms, but it would be January, and then you have to have one in,
April.
well, yeah, but do
The
we have to
budget,
have
for the
one in
budget.
between there? Right? So it would be January, almost January, March, and April, both. And then,
Well, I mean, I could see a situation where we have quarterly meetings and a budget meeting.
Okay, yeah.
yeah,
yeah, that makes
if you did
sense.
January, and then you did the March, April timeframe, and then another one in July, and then another one in October, something like that.
Yeah, whenever it's convenient for the committee. I mean, we get into the summertime and people go on vacation and so forth, so we may not meet in July, we may meet in August, or we may meet, the end of June. I mean, we don't have to stay to a strict calendar.
We don't, Madam Chair. My only concern is that if we're going to be, as staff, presenting regular reports, as much, time as we can get, it's going to cover this time zone, that would be helpful, but I understand where you're coming from.
And I do too. You're right.
Can I just make one quick comment on that? And that is, I get what you're asking for, like a high-level overview meeting in January, kind of where things are going. One of the concerns that we had with the February and the March meetings was trying to get the financial information together. By the time things get posted, by the time we have to have our reports done and everything, we have less than 6 months worth of data to be able to bring forward. So from a high-level perspective, we can provide direction, but from like a financial perspective, it's just going to, it's not a complete set of data to be able to provide, especially for budgeting purposes. And that's the challenge that we ran into with the existing schedule.
Right, and I don't think we were looking for you to provide all of that in January. So am I correct, committee, that, yeah, we don't expect the impossible?
Yeah, I like Bruce's thought about having the January meeting specific to the capital plan. Is there enough time in January to have that put together, at least with the understanding that it could change as revenues or
That's exactly it. We have the concept. We really start taking a look in November, December at our capital plans, but things don't come together until closer to probably March, April, that time frame. And so I just, I want to make that clear so that things will still be dynamic and change.
We put that plan together November, December, January, which we would be happy to share with you, but it's not until we get actual numbers from city finance as to what budget we have to work with that then we plug it into that CIP. So we would share with you our planning document, but by no means is that exactly what you're going to see in the budget. It would just kind of give you maybe a look ahead in terms of what we're looking at. But until we have those actual numbers and revenue that we can put in there.
I think I would appreciate seeing that. I mean, that would be, again, to me, to get the fire hose in February and again in March, that's not as helpful as regular discussions, right? So the quarterly regular discussion, even if it is, hey, this is where we are right now, that works, that helps me.
I agree. I think the quarterly meetings plus a budget meeting is a good idea. And certainly at the budget meeting, you can show us what's changed in the CIP. I mean, it's, that's the purpose of the budget meeting. But I think that's why we want to be certain that we have a budget meeting to look at the completed budget. so that there's not changes between us and the board, so that we see what the board is going to see. So, is that a problem? Is that okay? Is that a problem?
It's not a problem in so much as for that one particular meeting, we basically have a week window. And we have to schedule it during that week if you want to see those exact numbers. And then it comes down to someone may or may not be available, but that's one of the problems we ran into, was that we couldn't do it when we wanted to because of whatever. So we just need to be aware going into it that that meeting is going to be held this week every year, and you make it or you don't, because the timing with the overall budget is there's no room.
Well, can you give us a time when that meeting will be held? I mean, I think if the committee knows in advance what week that might be, then I think they would,
We can do that. We can do that.
work to be available then.
Just another comment. I'm struggling a little bit with how much we're involved in the budgeting and planning and how much we're involved in the oversight. And to some degree, oversight is looking back. And the January meeting might be an opportunity to look at the ongoing construction projects and see how they're doing, as well as maybe a glimpse at what might be potentially on the agenda for the CIP going forward. And so, I've struggled with the idea of, as Mike says, the fire hose on what it is in a budget that's going forward. But in some respects, I think we need, our role as I see it is to make sure that the reserves are programmed for the budget going forward, but also to look at what happened last year and how are we doing. And, this year, we're going to be looking at probably a continuation of some of the things we heard last year, which is we're still not where we want to be in terms of being able to meet the reserves, but our question is going to be, are we making progress? How are we coming along? And so at one level, it's dynamic information that's critical time-wise, and at another level, I think we need a more deliberate overview look to be able to assure this is what's happening, these are the areas we still have to work in, and in order for us to report to the board, I think we're going to have to report, obviously a factual situation, but at the same time, the progress is really, I think, what's important, as I would see it.
I agree with that. I'm a believer in reviewing things, taking a look at what we did before and how is it working, or is it not working? And did we do it right? Did we do it wrong? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to, change it? I mean, I think one of the faults in government sometimes is that they make an error and they don't want to admit it, and it goes on and on and on, and then it becomes a major problem. While I don't think this committee has made any errors.
Maybe we're the error.
Yeah, right. It doesn't hurt to check and to look.
David, would it also be possible in January to get a budget to actual on just your revenues and expenditures for the first 6 months? Just a printout quickly as of December 30th or the last day of December?
No, well, we can get you a budget to actual, but by the time that is reconciled, we want to be able to go through our process, even if we put it toward the end of January. It might be relatively close, but the only cautionary note I guess I would have with that is a lot of times we can do a budget to actual, but a lot of times revenues don't come in, a couple months behind. So we can provide the most up-to-date information we have as of a given time period, sure.
Yeah. Well, with the revenues especially, I'd like to see how we're doing at that time.
Okay, is there, yeah, sure, Randy.
I would like to echo what's been discussed as far as the January meeting. I think it's so important, if we're going to be meaningful in our actions when we make a recommendation on the budget, we shouldn't be in a position of having to get a drink out of a fire hose. And with the January meeting, that's going to help us provide something more meaningful. So I agree with that. And not to flog a dead horse as far as the membership of the committee, We will, are we going to make some recommendation so that the membership of the committee has some relevancy
I think that
to the subject?
I think the word relevant was what was going to be used.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see if there's anything else. We did, Dan, while you were out of the room, we talked about, you know we didn't. We want to be certain that the number 5, that the meetings are going to be quarterly with the first meeting in January.
Okay. I'll note that. Thank you.
And I guess you might have to say approximately quarterly. We're not going to absolutely say, oh, 30 days, 90 days has gone by, we have to meet again. So,
Did you want to say, Madam Chair, did we want to say quarterly with an additional budget meeting?
yes, quarterly with an additional budget meeting. But the first meeting would be in January.
And Madam Chair, if I may, just for additional clarification with regard to paragraph 5 and the frequency of meetings, I mean, certainly there's nothing wrong with providing for quarterly meetings and an additional budget meeting. The existing language here, you can see it's a mandatory requirement for the meetings to be held in February and March currently. Did you want the mandatory language to still be in there? Meaning
No,
this is a
no,
shall?
that needs to be deleted.
Okay, so so these meetings will be may at the discretion of the chair?
Yeah, right,
Okay.
and keep it at the, and then also additional meetings at the discretion of the chair.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so now 6. 6 is one we've been discussing. Somewhere in here, Dan, and I had a place for it, now I've lost it. I would like to say other projects as requested by the Board of Supervisors.
Okay, I can certainly fit that
Maybe under
in.
the purpose, add other projects as requested by the Board of Supervisors.
And Madam Chair, just so we're clear on the record, could you maybe further, just for further clarification, could you maybe perhaps provide a little bit more explanation as to what you mean by the term projects, just so I can be sure I include that term in the most appropriate fashion?
Well, sometimes the board asks us to meet for a specific purpose because something has come up. One year it had to do with affluent, and they wanted our input on running short on affluent. Another time it was, well, the rates on the hookup fees and so forth. So I can't tell you exactly what it would be because I never know.
So perhaps a better term would be issues, other issues,
Okay.
not project. Other matters.
Issues or matters
I like
are good
matters better.
suggestions.
Makes it sound.
Thank you
Does
for
that help?
That does, thank you.
So number 6, is that where we have a problem, Mr. Spell? No, this, oh, no, that's, okay. No, that has to do with the Policies and Procedures Manual, and actually, they have exempted us from some of the Policies and Procedures Manual, because there's limitation on, there's limitations on sitting on the board, how long you can sit on a committee and all that kind of thing. And so they have said that that doesn't apply to this committee. I mean, clearly, you're going to sit here as long as the person who appoints you wants you here and is in office. And so, you know, whereas on the Policies and Procedures, it says you can't be on a committee for more than 4 years. So,
So is that a conflict then?
yeah, I think it is a conflict.
What I mean by number 6 appears to be a conflict with that,
Yes.
serving it.
Dan?
So Madam Chair, I'd have to take a closer look at the most recently revised Policies and Procedures Manual for the BC&Cs. But, I mean, to the extent that there's a specific conflict, for example, with the terms, term limits, again, at the direction of this body, I'm certain that I can create some sort of language or craft some sort of language to carve out, any sort avoidance of conflicts so that there isn't a conflict.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Is there anything else on this that we want to make note of?
Not for me.
Madam Chair, just
Yes.
to get clarification on the financial, specifics, financials. So would you add that to number 3 then, that in reference to the October 13th report?
And Madam Chair, if I may, just to kind of springboard off of that last comment by Member Spell, and kind of harken back to what Darren was mentioning earlier on in the meeting, before this body entertains a motion and takes action on a motion with respect to these proposed changes to the resolution, what I would really like to request of this body is that in making that motion, that as council I'm provided with a lot of leeway, not substantively, but just, from a technical drafting perspective. So, as opposed to providing the changes or making those changes in specific paragraphs as they exist in the resolution, to give me as council a little bit of leeway in determining where I should be placing those new provisions, if I need to make other technical corrections throughout the rest of the drafted document, the existing document, for consistency purposes, so on and so forth. Not to change the intent, the purpose, or the objectives that we've discussed today, but just to actually carry through on all those things, but to make the necessary technical adjustments as I see fit. If that would be okay, I would certainly appreciate that.
Let me say that in case you didn't know it, he was a bill drafter at the legislature. And occasionally a bill came back that was supposed to be a horse and it came back as a camel.
I never had any involvement with those.
Okay. Is that agreeable with the committee that we give our council due leeway? All right, yes, that's fine. Okay. Is there any public comment? All right, not hearing any public comment. Let's see if somebody's prepared to make a motion.
Well, I'm not quite sure what we need here, Madam Chair, but I would, I guess, make a motion that we request our legal counsel to work with staff and our chairperson to incorporate the comments we've discussed today in a revised resolution to be considered at our October meeting.
Okay, that's a motion by Chairman Scott, by Member Scott. Do I hear a second?
Second?
Second from Member Mike Bennett. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? I guess I should have asked for comments, but I think we'd had enough of them. Okay, once again, I will ask for public comment. No public comment. I think we've already talked about future agenda items, so that you know that in October, we're going to look at this document for final approval, and then, and we'll be hearing a lot of financial information. And that's when we'll have finance here from the city also. So, are there any other comments, or do I hear a motion to adjourn the meeting? Anything else, staff, before I adjourn the meeting?
David just brought up, it should be mentioned that the next meeting is scheduled for the 19th of October at 1 p.m.
Very good. All right, everybody has that?
Yes.
Okay, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, I'm sorry I didn't get you out in an hour.